Okay, the first is from the British poet Ted Hughes. Over the span of the literary career of Ted Hughes, he produced quite a large body of work, which along with his poetry included plays, translation, and fiction. Among his prose works were several pieces of literary criticism, and he compiled several poetry anthologies for writers like Emily Dickinson and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. His first anthology was a collection of Shakespeare's verse, which Hughes introduced with a fantastic 60-page essay, which remains one of my favorite critical pieces of writing on Shakespeare. Hughes had decided on becoming a poet as a teenager and published his first collection at age 18, the same year he was accepted into Cambridge. He decided to defer university, opting for 2 years of military service. He worked as a radio mechanic in the Air Force, stationed at a remote base in northern England. He later said of this period that he had little to do but to read and reread Shakespeare and watch the grass grow. During this time, he memorized large amounts of Shakespeare and William Butler Yeats. Hughes continued this immersion in Shakespeare at Cambridge. He mentioned in letters to his sister that his routine was to get up at 6 and read a Shakespeare play by 9. That early bout puts me ahead all day. During these years, he was conducting a systematic reading of the Shakespeare canon, working through the plays and poems in the order which he thought they'd been written. This long immersion culminated, I think, in the introductory essay to his collection, A Choice of Shakespeare's Verse. The essay weaves together a range of thoughts and insights about Shakespeare, the nature of the Renaissance theater, and the intellectual and religious climate within which the works were written. I think Hughes, as an accomplished poet and playwright who had saturated himself with Shakespeare, is tremendously insightful in his study of Shakespeare's language, especially in Shakespeare's diction, his choice of words given the state of the English language at the time. With dual roots of Germanic and French heritage, and a newer influx of Greek and Latin terms imported into English by humanist scholars, Hughes studied Shakespeare's brilliance in synthesizing and fusing these disparate linguistic elements together in his poetry, in a process Hughes called forging a language of the common bond. A clear influence on Hughes's study of Shakespeare's language was Frances Yates, in both her book on Giordano Bruno and particularly her classic study on the art of memory. Yates traces the origins of this art from classical Greek poets and Roman orators like Cicero to medieval poets and philosophers like Dante and Thomas Aquinas to Renaissance figures like Petrarch and Giordano Bruno. Hughes weaves his understanding of the Renaissance art of memory into his study of Shakespeare's language. For an example of a passage from Hughes that first caught my attention, with his references to his sessions of sweet silent thought, so many hours must I contemplate, it seems likely in those days, when it was not unusual for men to spend many hours a day in contemplation, that Shakespeare used a technique based on a mnemonic system of emblems or seals like Giordano Bruno's. Hughes makes clear that he's offering this as a speculation. He has no biographical details about Shakespeare to base this idea on, and he's making inferences from certain aspects of Shakespeare's use of language. This left me with a question: could this or something like this possibly be true? And I made a point of looking for any evidence about the life of William Shakespeare and the art of memory in Elizabethan England to try and evaluate this theory from Hughes. At the time, I really didn't know anything about the authorship question. When I first started reading about the art of memory in Shakespeare, it was only a vague possibility in my mind that someone other than William Shakespeare of Stratford could have been the author of the works. Eventually, on a whim, I downloaded the audiobook of Margot Anderson's Shakespeare by Another Name, which I listened to on long walks around the city. And from the first chapter on, it was a revelation to me. That spring and summer, I listened to it several times over. And after waves of multiple revelations pouring into my ears from that book, for me personally, a major one dropped when the book came to the writings of Thomas Nash, specifically the dedication to Nash's 1593 pamphlet, Strange News. The pamphlet is cryptically dedicated to a master apis lapis, who this book argued was Edward de Vere, and it included a closing line from Nash's dedication. "Proceed to cherish thy surpassing carminical art of memory with full cups as thou dost." When I heard that, I was dumbfounded. I'd been searching for any connections between Shakespeare and the art of memory, and here was a book that was connecting de Vere to a surpassing carminical art of memory. And at the time, again, I didn't know anything about Thomas Nash. I'd never heard the word carminical before, but it was clear to me this opened up a whole new avenue of reading and inquiry. So for my presentation today, I'll be aiming at trying to understand as what was meant by thy carminical art of memory. So we'll begin what is the art of memory. I think it's best to start its definition by saying that it's a set of mnemonic techniques which had its origins among the poets and orators of classical Greece and Rome. The tradition in the classical world is that the founder of the art of memory was a Greek poet from the 6th century BC, Simonides of Ceos. Later Hellenistic scholars of Alexandria classified Simonides, along with poets like Sappho and Pindar, as one of the 9 melic poets, melos being Greek for song. So these were the 9 canonical lyric poets most worthy of study. For Simonides as the inventor of the art of memory, we draw from accounts from Cicero and Quintilian. The story goes that a nobleman had hired Simonides to compose a victory ode for a boxer to be recited at a banquet to be held in his honor. Simonides performed the poem, and the nobleman was not pleased by the lengthy praises for the twin gods Castor and Pollux that Simonides had incorporated into his work. He told Simonides he was only willing to pay half of the poet's fee and to get the other half from Castor and Pollux themselves. A little later, Simonides was summoned from the banquet by servants who told him that 2 visitors had arrived and were asking for him. When Simonides left to see who these visitors were, the banquet hall collapsed, crushing all the guests at the feast. The implication was that the 2 mysterious visitors were Castor and Pollux themselves, so the twin gods did compensate Simonides for the poem by saving his life. In the aftermath, as the rubble was being cleared, relatives of the guests began to arrive to remove the bodies, many of which were understandably not identifiable due to the manner of their death. What Simonides realized is that he was able to identify which body was which by picturing where everyone had been seated at the banquet. This allowed for the families to retrieve their loved ones and give them a proper burial. It was this incident, according to this fairly gruesome legend, that prompted Simonides to develop a new memory system that involved visualizing images arranged in specific locations, to use mnemonic images that are created by the practitioner to remind oneself of the thing one wants to remember, and then to set these images into some sort of spatial location that makes them easy to recall. So the story is obviously mythical. Quintilian even mentions that he doesn't think this story is literally true. But it's useful in the way that myths often are, in that it captures something essential. In this case, the idea of memory being assisted by images in places. So despite all the variations over the centuries in this art as it moved from the classical world to medieval Europe and again into the Renaissance, I think nearly all of the techniques contain 3 elements: visualization, association, and location. We can see this in the bedrock technique of the art, which many of you are probably already familiar with, the method of loci or the memory palace. Practitioners will choose a familiar building, and throughout the rooms of this building will visualize images that remind them of the information they want to remember. This art draws on one's capacities of imagination to translate abstract information that can be difficult to remember into a visual language that's easier to recall. This use of imagery also draws on the natural associative qualities of our memory, allowing one to make more connections to the information one wants to remember. And I think the real genius of this art is that it incorporates our innate capacity for mapping out physical spaces, and it allows us to use this ability to organize abstract information. So despite the wide variety of techniques that evolved over the centuries, I think the essence of this art can be distilled as images in places, images that you associate with the things you want to remember, organized into some kind of spatial arrangement. So if this art had its origins among the Greek poets, it was transmitted to medieval and early modern Europe by way of the Roman orators. In a social and political context which emphasized oratorical skill and valued giving long and persuasive speeches to political and legal assemblies, a trained memory was a powerful tool. Cicero is the exemplar here, so much so that in the academic literature, the art of memory is sometimes referred to as the Ciceronian memory tradition. In part, this is due to Cicero being regarded as the consummate Roman orator who had written on the art of memory in his De Oratore. His centrality here is also partly due to a guidebook, the Rhetorica ad Herennium, being mistakenly attributed to Cicero. Its actual author is unknown. This work is the sole classical text which contains complete instructions on the practice of the art of memory, and its perceived connection to Cicero's writings bolstered the prestige of the Ad Herennium in the centuries to come. As the Roman Empire declined in the West and Christianity developed, the role of public orators like Cicero diminished. The focus of knowledge and learning shifted toward the monasteries, and so the practice of the art of memory likewise shifted away from an emphasis on rhetoric. A major successor here to Frances Yates in the study of medieval memory culture is the historian Mary Carruthers. Her Book of Memory describes the medieval emphasis on memorization and composition of texts, as well as the internalization of scripture and wisdom. Some key figures in this discourse are Thomas Aquinas and his teacher Albertus Magnus, which both included instructions on memory cultivation in their works. Carruthers opens her book with some fascinating quotations about Aquinas' memory, and one that I particularly love is her depiction of Aquinas in the later years of his career, where he could compose masterfully structured theological arguments entirely in his mind, without any notes, seated in prayerful silence in his monastic cell. When it was time to transcribe these arguments, Aquinas would call on 4 of his brothers who served as his secretaries, and he would dictate 4 separate treatises at once, reciting the first section of the first to the first secretary, and then giving him a rest. He would dictate the opening of the second treatise to the next secretary, and so on to the third and the fourth, and then he'd begin with the first secretary with the second section of the first work. So apparently this made for a very efficient session of dictation. Knowing about the art of memory, it makes sense how this is done. If Thomas had his basic arguments of his treatise held in mind with a chain of images and places, moving from one sequence to the next, and then returning to a midpoint in a series of images, makes this entirely possible. Carruthers also includes another anecdote of a secretary, saying that Aquinas would sometimes fall into something like a state of sleep while he continued to dictate a treatise. Possibly this is exaggerated medieval hagiography, but Carruthers also forwards the idea that the intense levels of concentration involved in this process of memory and composition could induce something like a trance, and would appear to this bewildered secretary like a dictation issuing out of a sleeping St. Thomas. We have no way of knowing, but as one reads about the complex memory practices that were to follow in the Renaissance, especially with Giordano Bruno, the art of memory does seem to become sort of a contemplative exercise that can be practiced at length and alone, functioning almost as a method of meditation. So, like many arts, the art of memory was reimagined in the Renaissance, influenced by the rise of humanist learning and by Hermetic and Neoplatonist philosophies. As examples, I'd like to take a look at 3 figures to get a sense of the Renaissance art of memory: Giulio Camillo, Girolamo Cardano, and Giordano Bruno. With these 3 early modern figures, I think we can start tracing possible direct connections to Renaissance England and to Edward de Vere himself. So, Giulio Camillo was a philosopher and rhetorician who lived primarily in Venice in the early 16th century. He was involved in Venetian intellectual academies and was associated with figures like the painter Titian and the poet Pietro Arentino. Camillo was renowned for the central project of his life work, a construction of a physical wooden theater of memory. This artifact did not appear to survive the century, but from records, it seems that Camillo constructed at least partially 2 of these theaters. The first was in Venice, and the second was in Paris. King Francis I had invited a number of Italian artists to move to France, such as Da Vinci, Pietro Arentino, and Giulio Romano. When Francis heard of Camillo's memory theater, he invited Camillo to build a theater for him and instruct him in the use of this complex memory device. Camillo spent his final years as a pensioner to the Spanish governor of Milan, and in the final months of his life, he dictated to a longtime student an overview of the philosophy that was embedded in the images of the theater. This was published in 1550 as L'Idée del Teatro. Camillo's theater was basically a large lecture auditorium. The memory images were arranged so that standing at center stage, one would look out at an array of artistic depictions of figures drawn from classical literature. Images like Apollo defeating the Python, Vulcan lighting a fire, and Juno suspended in air. Each of the 7 rows and the 7 columns were assigned a range of symbolic meanings. So in this semicircular grid of 49 locations, where each image was placed expressed an aspect of Camillo's underlying philosophy. Camillo was devoted to the writings of Cicero, and it seems that Camillo included a drawer beneath each image. Into these went manuscripts that Camillo had drawn from the writings of Cicero and other classical authors. So each image in Camillo's theater represented not only a philosophical idea, but also served as a mental link to a manuscript of classical writings. In The Idea of the Theater, Camillo elucidates the philosophy that he is intending to express with these images, a philosophy that's derived from a Christian worldview that has been informed by Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and the Jewish Kabbalah. Camillo's theater was of interest to artists. Titian himself seems to have created an illustrated manuscript of Camillo's book, which, very unfortunately, was destroyed by a library fire in the following century. Two of the great poets of the Italian Renaissance also mentioned Camillo as well. Torquato Tasso wrote in a dialogue about the secret that Camillo had apparently taught to the French king, Francis I, and said of it that Camillo was the first since Dante who showed that rhetoric is a kind of poetry. Camillo is also mentioned in Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, writing that Camillo was he that showed a shorter path to the Ascrean fount divine. This fount at Ascra being mentioned here is the Hippocrene fount, located on Mount Helicon and said to be created by the hoof of Pegasus. It was sacred to the 9 Muses and near the home of the poet Hesiod, inspiring him with divine poetry and knowledge of the gods. It was one of these mythic fountains of the classical world where drinking of its waters was to fill oneself with poetic inspiration. In saying that Camillo revealed a shorter way to the Hippocrene fount, Ariosto seems to be indicating that the study of Camillo's theater contained immense value for a poet. Now, for Edward de Vere, I have no evidence at all that he knew anything about Camillo's memory theater, though if he had read and been influenced by Orlando Furioso, he would have come across Camillo's name at least in passing. Francis Yates mentions that Camillo's The Idea of the Theater was in John Dee's library, along with 4 other books on memory, and she cites this as an indication of the fact of when knowledge of Camillo's theater had reached England. Yates also mentions that though Camillo's book was published in 1550, his work continued to be a live point of discussion in Venetian intellectual academies into the 1580s, right through the period when de Vere was living in Venice. So there's a possibility that he could have heard about it in discussions with Venetian artists and intellectuals. Also, if de Vere was making pilgrimages to the places associated with his Italian intellectual heroes from earlier in the century, visiting the grave of Castiglione, I think possibly gathering information about Pietro Arentino, and most importantly, visiting Titian's studio, considering the connections that Titian and Arentino had with Camillo, this could also have been an avenue for de Vere to learn about this art of memory. So, Girolamo Cardano is almost never mentioned in discussions of the Renaissance art of memory, and I only really took notice of his use of the art of memory because of the emphasis Oxfordians have placed on Cardano. I'm glad that I did, though, as I think he could have had a very interesting approach to the art of memory, one that I'm not sure has been well studied yet. So, in the proceedings of a French academy in Lyon, from a century after Cardano's death, there was a report of Cardano saying that he owed everything he knew to this art, specifically to an art of memory derived from the medieval Catalan philosopher Ramon Lull, who was an important influence on many Renaissance practitioners of the art of memory, especially Giordano Bruno. Given that this was reported well after Cardano's death, I wasn't sure how much credence this could be given, but I think passages from Cardano's own work can provide some support for this statement being possibly authentic. So Cardano mentions in his autobiography that he had a poor memory as a child, and that when he was about 9 years old, his father taught him some sort of memory system. In his treatise on games of chance, he mentioned that when he was about 25, after a particularly bad night of gambling at cards, it dawned on him that he could devise a system for memorizing whole hands of playing cards. It apparently worked well, but more importantly, he realized that his system could be applied to many other purposes, including memorizing the contents of entire books. In his massive tome on subtlety, Cardano talks about using the art to memorize both words and numbers. He says that with this art, it is easier to remember 100 words or numbers than it would be to remember 10 without it. I found it intriguing to consider this Renaissance polymath who made great advancements in the mathematical fields like algebra and probability, employing this art to memorize numbers. The final figure I'd like to look at is probably the zenith of Renaissance art of memory practice, Giordano Bruno. As a young teenager, Bruno traveled to Naples for his education and became a novitiate in the Dominican order, which included the art of memory in its curriculum as an aspect of training effective preachers. Bruno seems to have quickly excelled in this art and possibly innovated his own distinct methods. While he was still a novice, he was called to Rome for an audience with Pope Pius and a prominent cardinal to demonstrate his art of memory. This apparently included a recitation of Psalms in Hebrew and a discussion with the attending cardinal about the fine points in Bruno's method. Several years later, in 1576, Bruno got in trouble with the Inquisition and had to flee to northern Italy, and then into Europe, beginning his decades as a wandering philosopher, making extended stays in France, England, Germany, and Bohemia. In Paris, Bruno became a university lecturer, and like Camillo, he was called for an audience with the French king regarding his memory techniques. He quickly composed his first guide to the art of memory, De Umbris Idearum, or On the Shadow of the Ideas, which he dedicated to Henri III, who granted him royal patronage for the rest of his time in France. Bruno's memory systems were quite complex, but in essence his technique was based on these concentric wheels of letters, derived from the medieval philosopher and mystic Ramon Lull. So for Bruno, in addition to memory palaces based on physical buildings, for more complex memory tasks, he could place his memory images on a variety of these lettered wheels. Bruno provides his readers with lists of what these letters stand for, and these become the building blocks of images these wheels create when they're set in motion. His largest wheel contains 150 places, and the letters stand for characters drawn from classical works like Ovid and from the Bible and from history. The letters stand for these characters, the actions these characters would perform, the objects these actions would be done to, emblems that the characters would be wearing, and so on. And as these wheels of letters were turned, from those 150 characters and their attributes, they would generate a staggering amount of unique memory images. Bruno's wheels were like the Swiss Army knives of memory training. They sharpened one's powers of concentration and visualization. They could serve as contemplative devices. They could be used to memorize information, and most impressively, the exact wording of texts. Bruno lived in London for about 3 years, from 1582 to 85. Assessing Bruno's impact on Elizabethan intellectual life is beyond the scope of this talk, but we can note that he had an important impact on figures like John Florio, his closest associate during these years in London, and also on several Elizabethan intellectual circles, like the one centered around Philip Sidney and Fulk Greville, and that which centered around Raleigh, Thomas Harriot, and Henry Percy. And of course, there have been many who have argued that traces of Bruno's life and thought can be found in the works of Shakespeare. Bruno's impact was wide-ranging and involved issues such as the importance of translation, the Copernican theory, and the idea of an infinite universe, as well as Bruno's system of memory. The clearest demonstration of this is a pamphlet war about the art of memory that broke out between a student of Bruno's, Alexander Dixon, and a Cambridge professor, William Perkins, who was a follower of the philosopher Petrus Ramus. Analysis of this pamphlet war can be found in Lena Wilder's Shakespeare's Memory Theatre and also in Ioan Culianu's Eros and Magic in the Renaissance. In essence, the followers of Ramus favored a more modern approach to memory that was based on logical categories. To them, the image-based art of memory belonged to an antiquated mode of rhetoric. Its use of iconography smacked of Catholicism, and for them, the often riotous imagery in the art of memory had a tendency to arouse the passions and give license for sin. Francis Yates described the essence of this pamphlet war. A dilemma was presented to the Elizabethans in this debate. Either inner images are to be totally removed by the Ramist method, or they are to be magically developed into the sole instruments for the grasp of reality. May not the urgency and agony of this conflict have helped precipitate the emergence of Shakespeare. This is again beyond my scope, but I think considering the art of memory as an aspect of the larger debate between proponents of the Ramist dialectic and defenders of older modes of rhetoric is an important part in the discussion of de Vere and the art of memory. For me, the place to start was Marshall McLuhan's study on the Trivium and Thomas Nash, and Skye Gilbert's Shakespeare Beyond Science. So, moving to writers who had closer known associations to de Vere, The poet Thomas Watson wrote a short Latin guide to the art of memory, the Compendium Memoriae Localis, or a compendium of place memory. Watson published this in about 1585, but Watson's fair copy manuscript of the text is dated to 1583, and it seems to be for a speech he delivered to the Inns of Court. It's a fairly short, occasional piece, but it contains a lot of interesting lines that I think shed light on Watson's approach to the art of memory and on the art being employed in a literary context. To me, the speech reads as a poet addressing an assembly of lawyers, making the case that the art of memory, which has been useful to Watson in his literary pursuits, can be of benefit to the Commonwealth as a whole, particularly in the practice of law and in the affairs of state. Watson published this speech 2 years after writing it, during the time of the pamphlet war between Bruno's student, Alexander Dixon, and the Ramus professor from Cambridge. I think Watson could have been registering his support of the art of memory at a time when it was being publicly questioned. Watson also wrote this guide in 1583, the year after his dedication to de Vere in Hecatompathia, which clearly demonstrated that Watson and de Vere were close literary associates. So I think Watson's compendium shows that writers in close proximity to de Vere were practicing the art of memory and putting it to literary purposes. So, to approach Edward de Vere's relation to the art of memory directly, I think this can be done through the writings of Thomas Nash. Nash's works include several references to the art of memory, but I think the most interesting and significant is his dedication to strange news, published in early 1593. Nash opens his dedication to the most copious carminist of our time, to his very friend, Master Apis Lapis. Let's first pause on that word carminist. It had given scholars trouble. It seems to be one of those Latinate neologisms that never caught on. But as carmine is Latin for poem or song, a carminist would be a poet. So the Master Apis Lapis in Nash's dedication is not only a poet, but the most copious poet of the time. For the identity of Master Apis, we won't have time to break that down here. I don't think this will be a problem, as many of you are already familiar with the argument that Nash is indicating that his very friend, Master Apis Lapis, is Edward de Vere. For anyone not familiar, there's a great article from Charles Burrell from 1944 on the SOF website, and the case is made in several other books like Anderson's Shakespeare by Another Name. I'll have to take it as a given here that Master Apis Lapis is Edward de Vere. I will say I've read over a number of cases for who Nash might mean by Apis Lapis. I've seen Orthodox scholars attempt to find a William Beeston, who is mentioned by John Payne Collier, though we have no records of any Beeston who was a poet at all, never mind the most copious carminist of the age. I've also read a case for Fulk Greville as Apis Lapis, but for me the case for de Vere is by far the most convincing, from a number of clues in the dedication, but even more so the place of the pamphlet in the context of the pamphlet war with Gabriel Harvey, which I think centers on the relationship between Gabriel Harvey and de Vere throughout the 1580s. So Nash ends this dedication. Proceed to cherish thy surpassing carminical art of memory with full cups as thou dost. Let's parse this line. Nash seems to be saying that this art of memory that is cherished by de Vere is a poetic art of memory. To me, that suggests more than an art of memory that could be used by a poet to store information that could be drawn on during the composition of verse. Though I'm sure this art could function in that capacity, a carminical art of memory sounds to my ear like something that is integral to the creation of poetry. Something like what Ariosto had said of Camillo's memory theater, showing a shorter way to the Hippocrene fount, or something like what Thomas Watson alludes to in his Guide of Memory. And when Nash says thy surpassing carminical art of memory, that surpassing indicates to me that de Vere has an art of memory that's in some way extraordinary, something that exceeds the more common art of memory practices of the era, something that's truly impressive in its scope and capacity. As I continued to think about this line, another aspect struck me. Nash is very oddly referring to this carminical art of memory as something to drink. Cherish thy surpassing carminical art of memory with full cups. So I could see someone saying continue to practice your surpassing art of memory, continue to exercise your art of memory, but I don't think I've come across anyone saying something like continue to drink your poetic art of memory. And so focusing on that phrase, with full cups, it seemed to me that I'd heard that phrase before, and I wondered, could this be a reference to the Latin motto from Ovid, on the title page of Venus and Adonis. I've seen this motto translated in a variety of ways, but I think about the most straightforward translation of the line, "Let the mob admire base things. For me, may golden Apollo serve me full cups of Castalian water." So the Castalian springs are another of these mythic fountains of the classical world, located at Apollo's temple at Delphi. The priests and visitors to the Delphic oracle would wash themselves in its waters, and water from the Castalian springs was used to clean the temple of Apollo. For the Roman poets, the idea of drinking from the Castalian springs was to infuse oneself with divine poetic inspiration. So the phrase "full cups" is within the line. Plena is full and pecula is cups. So my thinking is, if de Vere was the author of Venus and Adonis, and if de Vere in some way associated Apollo's fountain with his poetic art of memory, and Nash knew of this prior to the publication of Venus and Adonis, this would make sense of why Nash suggests that de Vere drinks full cups of his carminical art of memory. What further cements this notion to me that Nash's full cups is a reference to that line from Ovid is that Strange News was published just before Venus and Adonis. In New Style dating, Strange News was registered in January of 1593, and Venus Adonis was registered 3 months later in April. Nash seems to know, months in advance, that this motto drawn from Ovid's Amores will be included on Venus and Adonis. And it stands to reason that if Nash was close enough to de Vere to know that, he also could have known what that line from Ovid meant to de Vere. Nash was revealing something of his understanding in connecting the full cups of Castalian waters to this surpassing carminical art of memory. In addition to the registration dates of Strange News in Venus and Adonis, I think one should also consider Gabriel Harvey's reply to Nash in his Pierce's Supererogation that was published just after Venus and Adonis. Again, it's more than we can cover here, but Harvey seems to have multiple references to Venus and Adonis in his reply, and in one case he relates this specifically to things Nash had said in Strange News. Venus and Adonis is a target of allusion in this pamphlet exchange, and I don't think that Strange News is an exception. It's also interesting that Harvey includes in his reply a cryptic reference to the art of memory to Nash, and no such art memorative as a crabtree desk. I haven't not come across a satisfying explanation of that one yet, but I've got a few ideas, and so the search continues. I'd like to conclude my presentation where I began, with that essay by Ted Hughes. So there have been a number of recent academic works which discuss Shakespeare in the context of the art of memory. Cambridge University released a general anthology, and there are 2 recent monographs, Shakespeare in Memory by Hester Lee Jeffries and Shakespeare's Memory Theatre by Lena Wilder. They're all good books with a lot of useful information. I find, though, that while these books discuss Shakespeare's works in light of contemporary practices of memory, and they spot potential references to the art of memory in the works, they don't really touch on how a poet like Shakespeare might have used the art of memory. For me, the theory about Shakespeare's development of language that Hughes advances in his introductory essay is the closest we currently have to understanding how the art of memory could have been made integral to the composition of poetry. I couldn't manage to fit a discussion of Hughes's theory into this presentation. It was a little too complicated, and I didn't want to do it injustice by trying to compress it. I also find that Hughes has this poet's command of the language, where nearly every word he chooses suggests a line of argument, and when I try to unpack it, it ends up being 3 times as long and half as good. I also don't want to suggest that I think Hughes is necessarily correct. I do think I can spot some potential problems in his argument. Hughes himself admits that it might be impossible to know what Shakespeare's art of memory, how it might have functioned if he had one. But nonetheless, I think Hughes's argument is a beautiful one, even if we can't know if it's entirely accurate. I think his essay is probably the best starting point in trying to understand what could possibly be meant by a carminical art of memory. Thank you.
Time for questions. Sky.
So I thought that was fascinating, not only because you mentioned my book, but I want to say one thing, just an idea that maybe this thing about where did Shakespeare de Vere hear about Camillo's memory theater would be maybe with Sturm. So he went to Sturm, he studied with Sturm in Germany, we know that for sure, de Vere did. And apparently, I think it's in Yeats, I found a link between Sturm and Camillo's theater, that because he was a Neoplatonist mystic to some degree, Sturm. So, but I just want to say, so now I just want to get this, which you're not going to talk about now. What is Ted Hughes' theory? And I realize it's complicated because for me, figuring this out, first of all, I think the word association is perhaps really important. Like you said, part of the art of memory is about association, right? And I think that's very important, and it might have a lot to do with Shakespeare. In other words, free association, like a word brings up another word, an image brings up another thing. But I also think that it actually was about, in a way we should erase the word memory, because I don't think it's about the memory as we use memory, even though people did use it to remember, whole tracts and books. It's something to do with actually, it was their way of understanding the world to some degree. And that's the part I don't understand. So solve that. I know it's just kind of like, but you can't really, but that's, maybe you can have a theory.
Yeah. Well, I'll start maybe with the Ted Hughes. He is kind of on your, we do say art of memory sometimes, like Camillo's art of memory, his memory theater. Yeats definitely presents it as a memory device, but there's a really good book out from a London artist who she first did a whole work on Camillo's theater. She reproduced all the images before she read anything about him and did a whole gallery showing because she said, I didn't want to be biased by his book. Then she went into his book, and her name is Kate Robinson. Her thesis is online. But basically she says, it is kind of a memory theater, but it's more of a philosophical theater. He's expressing his philosophy in sort of a graphic depiction, and the images are used to remind you of that, but it wasn't so much an art of memory in that you could memorize a grocery list by it or something like that, which is usually thought of. So I'll go back to Hughes. So he basically writes in that upper book that's sometimes sold as Essential Shakespeare. It starts with a 60-page essay. So if you'd like, I actually did write out my take on his theory, which I could email to anyone that they'd like, but almost like it's 60 pages. It's probably better just to read him than me. But he's not even focusing like those other books on, he references the art of memory. Hughes sees him as using the art of memory in more of that philosophical sense, especially with the use of hendiades. So Hughes is really interested in the this and that of this. And he thinks that what Shakespeare was doing thinks he was doing a lot with that. And he was translating sort of a high language that would be appropriate to courtiers and humanistic scholars to a more common language. So you'd have a Latinate half of that, and then you'd have like a Germanic half of the hendiades. And that he thought that there was an image that he translated the image. So for one, he really likes in All's Well, the catastrophe and heel of pastime. That's one he really focuses on. And he thinks that the image of Achilles' heel is the translation of catastrophe being of a play, the lowest and last part, and the heel being the lowest and last part of the body, and also having that sense of the tragic flaw that would be the tragic flaw of Bertram. So he has a whole chart in there of what he thinks there's some sort of mythological image or practical, physical, concrete image that gets translated, and it's part of how Shakespeare kind of weaves together high and low languages. I was hoping to actually bring a paper of this with me, but I didn't have time to do that. But I made my speech with footnotes and endnotes and where you can find a lot of these books. So if anyone just wants to give me their email, I can send you that. So,
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I'm glad you translated carminical, because with my my chemistry background, it's a red crystalline dye.
It may have overtones of that. It may have overtones of like a ruby color. There may be more than one thing going on in that.
But in terms of the Memory Palace of Matteo Ricci is an interesting book. He was a Jesuit who went and died eventually in China. And that was my introduction to that theory or that usage.
Yeah, fascinating book.
Anybody else from over here so I can minimize my walking? Yeah. Excuse me.
Just like to bring in a parallel. One of the things we've been talking about are things where the Elizabethan and Jacobean age were so different from our own, things that existed to them that don't. A few years ago, a young journalist named Joshua Foer was looking for something to write articles on and found out there were memory contests in America, people who specialized in memory, and he wrote first an article and then a book, Moonwalking with Einstein. And he discovered, among many things, two interesting things. One, all of these memory experts use Cicero's Ad Herennium. It's almost no classicist knows that lobe by Harry Kaplan, but all these people did. Two, which really moved me the most, we are what we remember. And the removal of memory from our educational system, which is the villain John Dewey's doing, because it frustrates the originality of young people if they remember. Absolutely the opposite is true. The reason why people like Dante and Shakespeare and were so creative is because they remembered. This is the great line in George Orwell's book in which what shall we toast to? To the future. And Winston Smith says, to the past. And his fellow says, yes, the past is more important. That's what we know. And that's why this is really this talk is not only important for us, important for every educator in America, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you.
You can talk amongst yourselves while I amble over here.
Daniel, congratulations on a truly impressive
thank you.
presentation.
Thank you.
I don't know if I have a question, but I have a comment, and I look forward to more conversation with you. In doing this Shakespeare Illusion book with Alexander Waugh, if I had to pick one thing that we don't understand about these early modern thinkers and creative people that we should, it's this. It's what you're talking about, because this type of schematic, the importance of places and their associations is an underlying thing that unlocks a lot of what they were saying about Shakespeare in a way that the Stratfordians don't understand. So I hope that you will continue to develop your expertise in this area and bring it to us.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Anybody else before I call on Sky a second time?
I'm just thinking that when you mentioned that thing about Henadius, I can never pronounce it, Henadius or whatever, it made me think of paradox. And it strikes me that this would be an art of memory thing totally for Shakespeare, because he's totally obsessed with paradox. Yeah. So in other words, if you think light, you've got a whole array of images of dark that are going to come up. As soon as you mention one thing, you have its opposite. So to me, this is part of a way in which this may have worked for Shakespeare, because there's this wealth of imagery that he has, but also, anyway, that's my idea.
Well,
I just thought of that. So
he really has the compressed version, Hughes does, in the essential Shakespeare, but then it's mainly the same thing in the Shakespeare and the Goddess of Complete Being, but he does expand on it a little bit. And he has this chart of like how he thinks it goes sort of like in a Neoplatonic way of like the form down to the, so he'll have the heel going to Achilles' heel, going to catastrophe, so he thinks that he's translating abstract to concrete always, and then he's also translating it into different languages so that he can combine the languages. That's Hughes' theory. I do think there are a few problems with it, but we can talk about that some other time.
Again, thank you to Daniel Cowan.